In a flash flood, one cowboy risked everything to save a child's life. The words arrived as thunder already was, as if the valley meant to make them literal. A clear morning, sun baking the red mesas, wind like an old man's hand over dust and sage, gave no promise of what the arroyo kept hidden. But the arroyo had a memory, and it remembered last night's thunder in the headwaters far upriver, where a thundercloud had bled itself out until the gullies filled and the hills sent their melted weight down like a fist. Clara Winslow felt the morning like a small mercy. Her hands were heavy with the lullaby weight of her daughter, June, who slept beneath a shawl at her breast, lips soft as a new moon. Clara's wagon rolled slow on the ruts toward Maggie's place, 3 days' travel by road if the oxen held and the sky stayed clear. She had her sister's letter folded in the breast of her jacket, the curl of Maggie's scrawl promising a bed and fresh bread and a place for a widow with a child. It had been nearly a year since the fever took her husband. The cotton around Clara's life still felt damp with it. Every mile north promised a new dry place to lay the pieces of her life. Tom Breslin sat on the wagon bench with the sort of small, practical talk that keeps roads from becoming silence. He had been hired by the Winslow family of Silver Ridge for the run, driver and spare hand. Tom's laugh was thin but frequent. He had a way of directing the oxen that made them obey with less swearing than some men needed. He kept his hat low and his eyes on the path where the track narrowed and the gullies made it treacherous. "Lighten the load," Tom said at one point, nudging a packed crate. "Don't be stubborn, Clara. Rain's been in the hills. Saw the sky churn last night. Best to keep the little uns under cover." Clara smiled, squeezed June's head. The baby stirred, hungry and calm, a small hot weight in the folds of Clara's shawl. "Maggie's stew'll be worth the ride," she answered, "and your boss'll eat his fill and pay you what he's promised." They were only 3 hours north of Silver Ridge, the red rock falling away to scrub and thin cottonwood by the creek. The day felt honest, honest enough to get up and dress and cross country without ceremony. Children across a dozen settlements would be getting water from the same river that morning. Men would be striking flint, hauling feed. No one imagined an arroyo could turn into a wall in a single breath. Clouds gathered like a secret. By the time the first heavy drop hit the wagon's canvas, a hum of the land shifted. Nuts and small things that flee before a storm. The distant rumble that was not thunder alone, but a building mass of water moving through the bones of the earth. Clara had heard of flash floods in the territory. Every woman had some story, but she had not known the particular sound it makes. A dry ground flute that goes sour, then is replaced by an immense hungry roar. The road gave a shudder. Tom swore softly to himself and urged the oxen faster, trying to beat the water's rise through low country. But the arroyo doesn't negotiate, it simply decides. The first wall of water hit the far slope and began to run and fold itself into the gullies. It coalesced, gathered speed, and by the time it saw the wagon, it was not an animal, but a machine, a wall that would move without mercy. "It came up fast," Tom called, voice higher now. "Hold her, Clara, hold the child." The wagon lurched, the canvas snapped back like a throat clearing. June woke with a small, confused cry that turned to a keening when the water tipped the wheels and the world turned to white noise and wood. Clara remembers all that as if it were happening in 3 different rhythms. The small, intimate rhythm of her hands clutching her child's shawl, the loud, irreducible roar that filled her ears, and the far-away, precise movement of a horse's hoofbeats. In the middle of the chaos, there was a sound that cut like a bell, the steady, fearless thump of a horse pounding earth that was still dry a second before. She could see nothing but spray and the inside of the overturned wagon when hands found her. They were not the hands of the driver. They were broad and rough. They belonged to a man leaning over the wreck with water washing around him. For a moment, Clara did not know whether the hand belonged to a living man or a figure out of a fever dream. A horse reared and bled water off its flank.
A man's hat was a dark smear above it. He was a silhouette against spray, a ridge of shoulders, a face that, when the water and light let her see it, had the kind of plainness that invites trust rather than suspicion. He moved like a man with a single purpose. Rowan Hale had been riding out along the river that morning because the river, like all useful things in that country, demanded inspection. Rowan's late brother had taught him watchfulness. Watch the land and it will tell you what it needs. He kept to the edge of the mesa, looking for breaks in the fence and signs of the spring that fed the Duncan's bottom. He kept away from people mostly. Ranch work and the cold that lives after grief had shrunk him inward. Too many years ago, a fever had taken Maria and Christopher from him, and the house where he had once kept a plate in the oven had become a room he passed through without opening his hands. He had told himself he would not get involved again. He told himself everything possible, up until the moment the river showed him a wooden basket and a baby within it. It was not thinking. Someone later might call it courage. Rowan would call it an inability to go back to being a man who watched only his own fences. He spurred the horse and rode the rim of the flood, then dove, letting the animal pitch itself at a place where the water thinned against a sandbar. The horse buried its head and pushed. Rowan felt the power of it, and then he felt nothing but the river and oxygen and a single stubborn focus on a baby's cry. The wagon was a boat of failure. Tom Breslin had been thrown clear when the axle snapped. His hat bobbed downstream a moment like a dead bird. The wagon tipped and the canvas ripped free, and June was thrown against the seat. Clara hung on to the rail with one arm and reached for the child with the other, but the river had such plans. She could not haul them both out. Her fingers slipped. The water took Tom when he tried to catch the wheel. He went under with the kind of soft shock that turns a man's face to something hollow on the current. "Sir, please," Clara heard herself shout, words that might as well have been a prayer. Rowan's hand was there. He put a boot on the overturned wheel, holding himself against the flow the way a well-set post holds against wind. With one arm he steadied the wagon, still riding the flood's power like a thing he had to command. With the other he reached inside, his fingers finding the small soft shape of June, wrenched from the bundle and into his chest. He wrapped the wet shawl to her face, pressed until the baby coughed and then breathed. He saw Clara's eyes for the first time, huge, fierce, and stripped to bone by terror. In those eyes he saw the stubborn takeover of desperation a mother wears when she gives everything she has. She was willing to die rather than let a child drown. Rowan felt that, and something in him that had been sealed for years began to give. "Give me the child," he said, a command and a plea both. Clara's hand opened. She set June into his arms like a transfer of the most sacred thing. It was the act that would change both their lives, a stranger entrusted with the small hot weight of another mother's life. "Hold her close," she breathed. "Don't set her down." He wrapped his arms, knelt against the wheel with June safe, and reached for Clara. The river had already wrapped its powers around both of them. Rowan's boots found something, a fining seam beneath the water. He hauled Clara free, and for the first time in years he had another's life in his keeping. He did not know how to do that. He learned in the swift current. Brace, pull, hand over hand, a launder of muscle against nature. Tom Breslin's hat came free and past them, gentle, useless, and then a silence that was not silence, but a continuing roar. Men later would call Tom's last look one of started acceptance. The arroyo took what it would take, without malice, because it had no malice to give. By the time Rowan had both of them riding his horse, Clara clinging to the side, June tucked inside his jacket, they had found a sandbar 100 yards downstream where water scoured the bank into a small, treacherous calm. Rowan set them down on a patch of wet sand like one sets a thing down on a table. The horse stamped and snorted, chest heaving.
The baby squirmed and then settled, small fists coming to cheeks. Santos was there before they reached the ranch proper. He had been at work in the corrals when the storm bit the land, and the river turned itself into a highway of wood and mud. He ran like someone who had been running his whole life. Santos had a face that carried the sun and the shadow of Sonora. Age had given him a patience like a lesson learned and not punished. He knelt, wrapped his broad hands in a blanket, and held June with a tenderness that made Clara feel in a single sharp heartbeat that strangers could be angels, and that angels might be men who had known loss. "Bless the child," Santos said, more to the air than to anyone particular. His voice had a warmth like coffee. He worked deftly, stripping wet cloth and patting the baby dry, cooing nonsense that made June blink and then yawn. Rowan sat with his hat in his hands. He had salt running down his temple in thin lines. The river had left a groove in his ribs with tossed debris, his forearm cut, not deep but marking the skin. He said nothing at first. Silence is a speechwriter's avoid, but fishermen and farmers treasure. Clara studied him the way you study a tool you are about to rely upon, for faults and for strength. "You're hurt," she said, at last. "A scratch," Rowan said. "You'll be warm inside the house." She rose on hands that still trembled and let Santos take June into the kitchen of the ranch house, where a fire, improbably, had been kept by someone who knew storms and the caution they required. Rowan followed more slowly, as if the house itself might mean something more than just shelter. It meant hands around a child, bread, a readiness to help. A man like Rowan living alone with a hired hand like Santos did not invite company often. He had thrown his doors open in the kind of way men do when they cannot bear to see someone drown in a flood and not act. Inside, Clara sat on a chair as if she might melt into it. The house smelled of wet wool and burned stew. Santos had set June on Clara's lap after he checked her breathing and wrapped her in a dry shawl. Clara looked at the child and felt something loosen and then clamp. She had given her baby to a stranger and not died, and that was a small revolution. Rowan moved about the house with the economy of someone who avoids useless talk. He boiled water, tore strips of linen, cleaned the scratch on his forearm with careful fingers. Clara watched his hands, broad, competent, scarred perhaps, and the way he moved, as if a man who had been wounded by grief learned new measures for pain. "You have a name?" Rowan asked once after Santos left to tend the fire. "Clara Winslow," she said. "June's my girl." "You're headed north," Rowan said, not a question but a confirmation. The river had told him that by the look of her load. He had not meant to pry. Sorrow had a way of making one intimate with strangers. He knew what driving a wagon meant, where the brakes would give way, which ruts held water. It was a practical sympathy, the kind that no church sermon can replace. Clara's laugh was tired and quick. "Maggie Duncan's," she said. "She sent the letter. Said she'd make room." "Silver Ridge people?" Rowan asked, because the land makes its own maps. "Yes." She blinked. "We thought we'd be there by noon." Rowan looked at the clock on the mantel, an old brass thing that ticked like a patient man. "You won't get there today," he said. "You'll get there another day." She swallowed. "Tom—" "He didn't make it," Rowan said quietly. He saw the shadow in her face and did not make it louder than it was. Death is a thing that takes its own shape, according to how it meets different hearts. Clara's grief was immediate and bright, and Rowan's had been long and hollow. Both were real. Santos poured water into a tin basin and set a cup of coffee near the hearth. He said nothing, because sometimes the thing needed is not speech, but the steady presence of someone who will not leave. When Clara could move, she set about the small, practical work of grief. She wrapped Tom's empty hat in oilcloth, took inventory of what had been lost. The crate of flour, battered and floating and now ruined, a small box of letters now soaked, a sack of seed that might yet sprout if buried deep and tended. She accepted help without feeling like a defendant. In that hour, help was common law and not charity.
Rowan fixed a bandage on his forearm without fuss, then sat opposite Clara, and with the kind of blunt ease that belongs to men who have been simplified by a single focus, began to tell the small chronology of his life. He did not try to hold back the fact of what had driven him out into the flood. "I would have stopped," he said, "if I could have done any good by not riding out. I couldn't stand it. The thought of a baby in water. Couldn't stand it." He looked down at his hands. "I lost mine. A fever took them. I had no one to hand to and no one to hold me. I thought it easier to keep the house and the cattle and not make room for another. But I couldn't watch a child go and do nothing. If that's something heroic, I don't know. It just seemed like what had to be done." Clara listened as if she were reading a very small, private letter. Here was a man who had closed the door on himself and then opened it with the force of an instinct no grief could close. She felt the tenderness like a sore being touched. "You didn't have to be hero," she said softly. "You just did." Rowan's mouth tightened. "Maybe that's all any of us can be. A thing you do when the moment asks for it." June slept in the crook of Clara's arm, while the two adults sat and let the world reload itself. The wind outside had edges now. The river had been down to a low, humble whisper, as if ashamed. The bright heat of midday began to assert itself. Birds returned to the scrub, as if nothing had happened.
The sound of the flood was memory, but not vanished. It left a ringing like a bell in people's ears for days, in their bones for months. Santos washed and mended what he could, humming under his breath. He had a family back in Sonora, he said later, and he missed them like a tide. He moved with the dignity of a man who knows exactly how to keep a household together, even when the household includes a widow and a baby and the man who had saved them all. He brewed more coffee. He doctored Clara's hands, cleaned Tom's things, and swept the mud from the doorstep like an act of defiance. The simple, practical necessities kept the way grief and heroism intersected from becoming merely a story. They made it a life. Clara, who had been so fragile a season ago, began to decide things. She wrote down the names of the things she needed to replace. She set a letter burning in a pan because the wet had made its ink illegible. She asked Rowan for clean water, and then, with a steadier voice, for the name of his ranch and whether he could show her the road that would lead her north once the ground would hold a wagon. Rowan told her the valley's name, Hale's Bend, 1/2 mile of good pasture and a spring that kept its mouth through drought. He said she could rest there until the road dried and then travel without trouble. He did not offer to escort her because that was not in his nature to make offers with promises attached. He offered instead the house and Santos and a place to sleep. "You're welcome to it," he said. Clara surprised herself by asking, later, a thing she had not meant to. "Why did you ride alone today?" He looked at her, and in that look she read something that a town book might have called penance, but which in life was just habit. "Because I see what I don't want to be," he said. "Because I was afraid that if I opened my hand again, I'd lose something else. But when I saw the child," he stopped, chose a simple phrase, "I couldn't watch." The moment between them made a small map of futures that had not existed the morning before. It was not a vow, not a poem, not an instant conversion. It was the first quiet thread of trust between a woman who had lost much and a man who had chosen to risk himself for what he had no right to save. When the storm had passed substantially and Clara had packed what could be salvaged, 2 dresses folded under a dry blanket, a small bonnet for June, the letter from Maggie carefully preserved, she moved toward the door with the intention of reaching the Duncan homestead by the next day. Before she left, Rowan came with a hand that held something wrapped in linen. "It was Tom's," he said, offering the hat. "I found it snagged on a bush when we pulled clear. If you want to bury him proper, I'll give you the place. Santos will see to it." Clara took the hat and held it to her chest. Her throat made a sound like a small animal. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping us both alive." He nodded. "You make your own way," he said, gruffly soft. "And if anyone gives you trouble down the road, you come back. We'll stand by the law and by each other." She folded the hat into the oilcloth, and, in the private geometry of grief, found herself telling him more than she had meant to. "My name is Clara Winslow," she said, "and the girl's name is June. I'll write to Maggie as soon as I can, but—" "You can ride with the wagon when it goes," Rowan said. "It's slow, but it's safer with company." Clara hesitated. The road to Maggie meant distance, and distance was the kind of thing that could feel like a remapping of the heart. She looked at June, sleeping, and thought of the shelter of being with others. "All right," she said at last, "but I won't be a burden." "You won't be," Rowan said. Outside, the land had a hush, but hush is often a place where another kind of danger lurks. The valley held people who counted water like a ledger. The thing about a spring in this country was that no one person held absolute control. Men like Dawson Kincaid measured land as an account, and where accounts were in dispute, they had been known to use more than letters to settle the score. Rowan had seen the Kincaid sign on cattle where it had no right to be. He had heard rumors in the dusty drift of barrooms that Dawson wanted the Duncan's spring, which fed the bottomlands. To the Kincaid family, water was not just water, it was leverage. No one said Kincaid's name aloud in the Hale house, as if saying it might summon trouble. But sometimes names are the first sign of a storm. When a rider crested the ridge that afternoon, dusty, panting, and holding a paper like a talisman, Rowan saw the line of worry cut through the man's cheek before the news came. "Trouble down at the Duncan place," the rider panted. "Kincaid's men were asking after a woman, asked if the Duncans taken in a Winslow, threatened they'd come on court day with more men if they didn't get proof of claim to the spring." Clara's hands tightened around June. The name hit like someone punching the air. The flood had been one kind of danger. Then there was human hunger, which wore suits and smiled and used law as a battering ram. Rowan put a hand on the rider's shoulder, steady in the way a man steadies a child. "You go tell Marshal Briggs what's what," he said. "We'll see to the Duncans. Thank you for riding." The rider nodded and spurred away like a man who was suddenly important to his own calm. Santos folded his hands and fixed his face like a man making up a meal plan in his head. Clara felt the two dangers fold together like a pair of hands. First the pour of water, then the slow, patient pressure of men with more cattle than conscience. She had come north for bread and a room, and instead found a flood, a funeral, and now a landowner who saw a spring in terms of gain. "You're welcome to stand with us," Rowan told her, not as a suggestion, but as a covenant. Clara looked at June, at the small, round face, and then at the house where she had found shelter. She had been given more than shelter, a place to rest, and men who could act. She had the right to decide what to do next. She set the hat down, folded the letter from Maggie, and made a choice in a voice as steady as could be. "I'll go to Duncan's," she said. "I'll tell what happened. I won't be a bargaining piece for anyone." Santos nodded. "We will ride together," he said, "as neighbors." Rowan saw the decision in her like a spark. He also saw, beneath it, a flame that might become something new. He had saved a child's life. He had not planned on saving a mother's faith in others, but that, too, had been delivered. He thought of the spring and what it promised to those who owned it, and he thought of the look in Clara's eyes when she had given June away into his arms. The flood had taken, the flood had given. For all the river's indifference, human care had bent itself into being. They readied a horse and a small cart, prepared for the short ride to Duncan Homestead, where Clara's sister Maggie and Thomas Duncan held to a claim and a spring. The road would be slow. The wagons had to be cautious on rutted ground. People in the valley were already talking. A kind of rumor acted like a second current, faster than the physical river, running through every saloon and livery stable and filling the mouths of men who liked to measure other men's trouble. Before they left, Rowan tightened his bootlaces, checked his pistol with the same care he used in mending a fence. He did not mean to be a man in a story where he was a hero. He meant only to be a man who couldn't turn away when another life was in peril. That, in the end, was how most courage began, by a refusal to be casual about another's danger. Clara looked back at the Hale house, at the porch where Santos leaned with his arms folded, at the small pile of tools that had been set to dry. The valley responded to the storm one thing at a time. A broken fence, a lost hat, a complaint to the marshal. The Kincaid name cut the air like the memory of a ripple that promised more upheaval. She put June into her arms and, with the deliberate calm of someone choosing a future, climbed onto the cart. As they set off, the sky seemed to hold its breath. If you're watching from a town with a creek of its own, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. This one moves across land we all know the smell of. They rode out of Hale's Bend toward the Duncan homestead with a quiet that was not peace. The next phase of danger lives in long human processes. A landlord's greed, a neighbor's fear, a marshal delayed by distance. The flood had been quick and precise. The next threat would be slow as a drought and twice as deliberate. As Rowan's horse walked the softened trail, he felt the tightening in his chest that grief had taught him to recognize. The small hollow that opens when you imagine losing someone you have just begun to care for. It was a measure of risk that had nothing to do with the wild river. A risk of opening to life again, of letting his hand be seen as warm and not merely useful. He held June a moment as the cart jolted, and the baby smiled in her sleep, unaware that a man had crossed a dam of water for her. At the ridge, they saw the Duncan homestead's low roof and the cottonwoods trembling with the wind. A plume of smoke rose, not from the manor, but from a back chimney, the evidence of stew and life continuing despite the day. Men were gathering already, neighbors who do not always speak well, but always answer when the law or danger requires it. The river had made them honest in a way nothing else could. Rowan pushed himself up on his stirrups and let his gaze move beyond the homestead to the low line of scrub where tracks told a story. Two sets of boot marks ran parallel to one another, heavy, deliberate. The Kincaid brand, as much rumor as brand, had been stamped into the valley many times. Men like Dawson Kincaid used not only rope but paper and intimidation when they wanted spring water. They had been looking for Clara, the rider had said. That sent a weight into the air as palpable as humidity. Clara caught his eye across the cart and nodded once. It was not the brave nod of a theatrical heroine. It was the practical nod of a woman whose child was safe and who would not be moved into barter. She had decided to face whatever came, with the testimony of what had happened at the arroyo when the water had roared and a cowboy had dove and taken her child into his arms. Rowan felt the way the valley collects names and tucks them under its rocks. He tightened his grip on the reins and headed down the road, toward people who might be grateful, toward people who might be afraid, and toward men who might be prepared to measure the worth of a human life against the width of a spring. They had not been at the Duncan place an hour before the valley's small council gathered like weather forming. Men came walking, men came on horses. Some came with lanterns, because things that begin wrong often end in late nights. Word moves differently on dirt roads, quicker than a petition, slower than rumor, the way a current takes what it pleases and gives nothing back. The Duncan's yard filled with boots and rough hands, with the shy shuffle of women whose minds were on children and milk pails, with the crinkle of maps folded into rough paper, and the metallic scrape of a sheriff's badge catching noon light. Marshal Briggs arrived last, sweating and composed, the kind of man who wore law like a second skin. He had the look of one who keeps an atlas of men in his head, a place for the honest and a place for those who prefer their accounts balanced with threats. He doffed his hat, tipped it to Thomas Duncan, then to Clara. His voice was careful and territorial, the voice that could read a complaint and know what to do with it. "We'll do this by the book," Briggs said. The phrase landed like any promise in those parts, soft as a prayer, depending on who heard it. "I can set a hearing. I can deputize men to keep peace until we can get sworn testimony. But I can't be everywhere at once. We'll need neighbors to stand watch and keep this from becoming a private war. Dawson Kincaid did not come to the meeting dressed as a villain. He came dressed as a man who had climbed and counted and kept. He came with the slow, patient air of someone used to seeing the world bend to ledger and brand. Dawson had a son who favored his jaw, Garrett, and a retinue of men who were not inclined to question what gain meant. Kincaid's lean face smiled like a coin. He stood under an arm of cottonwood and listened, his hands folded in front of him. "You've taken in a Winslow?" he asked. Not a question for the moment, but a means of measurement. "You say she, Clara Winslow, had misfortune at the arroyo?" Clara stood with June, the child wrapped in fresh linen Santos had lent, and answered plainly. She was no longer raw as the morning of the flood. There was a thread of steadiness in her voice that bore what the valley taught women who must tell the truth and expect consequences. "My husband drowned. I was saved from the water thanks to Mr. Hale. That's what happened," she said. "I won't be used as proof of claim or as a bargaining chip." Dawson's mouth flattened for a breath like a cloud passing the sun. He was practiced in language like this: gentleness as leverage, civility as rope. "You'll excuse my caution," he said. "Springs are a dispute waiting for law to find them. I only ask that, until there is evidence, the Duncans allow no interference." Thomas Duncan answered with a kind of farmer's bluntness that could not be bought. "My family's lived on this claim for 20 years. We have deed and sweat. If you have a claim, bring it to court. Don't come looking for a woman to make your grades. We won't be bullied." The crowd hummed. Men shifted their weight like a crowd of creatures sensing rain. Morrison, a rangy rancher with a face like weather, spoke up in a voice that was more rumor than speech. "We should ride together if Kincaid means to push. If he brings men, we'll be ready." Briggs nodded. "I'll get a writ to the territorial seat. We'll set a hearing. Until then, I'll leave Deputy Hart and a man or two. But I warn you, none of you take the law into your own hands. If anyone starts shooting to settle accounts, I'll see that they answer for it." That was as good as a prayer in the territory. A law that could be slow and as certain as the sun. For now, it held. Men dispersed with plans, with promises to sleep in shifts, to keep a watch. Rowan and Santos stayed late into the lengthening light, talking the unpoetic of homesteads, fence posts, the spring's tongue, where a man might set a post to keep water from wandering. When night fell, the valley made a quiet that was both relief and trap. Stars pricked like small punctures in the dark. The wind that had filled the day with meanings grew colder. It slid over the homestead as if testing what it would find. Clara slept in the Duncan parlor, June warm on her chest, and imagined she could fold the day's terrors into a neat parcel. She wrote down what she had seen by the light of a tallow lamp, names, times, the way the water had taken the wagon, and then sealed the paper. She would give that statement to Briggs in the morning. She would speak in a law's language, because the law was the one thing that could keep men like Dawson Kincaid from making a livelihood out of other people's misfortune. But human storms don't always respect papers and sealed writs. They make their own counsels. Shortly after midnight, a shadow slid like a lie across the Duncan yard. Boots came with it, soft, practiced, many. A lantern flared, then was smothered. A rope creaked. It was not the voice of Dawson that reached the house first. It was the metallic whisper of men taking positions. The plan was plain enough to those who had seen such things before. To come at night, to rattle the door and make a show of force. To frighten the people inside into surrender, or to create a pretext for violence that could be denied in daylight. Clara woke to the sound like a thing being pried. Wood shifting, a voice low and dangerous. Santos's voice rose, steady and deliberate. "We have company," he said. He moved like a man whose life had been measured by keeping hearths and cattle. Rowan followed, his gun strapped, but his face steady, the same expression that had carried him into water that morning. The attack was not a set piece of muskets and screaming men. It was a slow encroachment. Men peering into windows, half glances in the dark, one figure moving to pry at a shutter. Someone pounded the front door with the intent to rouse fear. Someone else tried the back. A lantern caught and was stomped out. The Duncans and their neighbors responded with what they had. A small cry to alarm, the rattle of pots, the nervous clank of a toolshed door. A handful of neighbors, Morrison among them, Cooper, Bill Weatherby, and Chen, answered Rowan's low call. They moved like a small pack, quiet and practiced. Inside, Clara did as she had been taught: protect the child. She wrapped June in another shawl, kissed the sleeping face, and followed Thomas Duncan to a hidden place they called the root cellar. It was not romantically named. It was dark and smelled of earth and hoarded potatoes. The cellar had a small, heavy door and a dirt floor, and in that closeness Clara folded herself around June and listened to the noise of the night outside, which sounded very much like danger.
Santos would not leave. He shut the root cellar and pushed a plank into place with hands that shook because the day had given him grief, and also because a chest can bear only so much. "Stay quiet," he said. "We'll be out here." That phrase, "we'll be out here," was a covenant. Men sometimes meant it to be about bullets and buckshot. Other times, it meant they would stand law and witness and truth. The attackers tried the door at the front like they intended to break the house down, and guns answered in the night. The shooting was a savage punctuation that meant to scare. The old house creaked under the pressure. Clara could feel the thud of footsteps over her head. The scrape of furniture moved to block a way. She held June to her chest and hummed a lullaby without words. It was the small human tactic, to bring warmth against the cold noise. There were bursts of sound, quick, sharp, then far, where men exchanged fire across the yard. Rowan, who had been in the yard directing the small ring of defenders, moved with a care that suggested the difference between bravado and responsibility. He did not shout. He did not risk flaring courage into needless exposure. He and Santos moved as one, their actions a kind of choreography, covering a flank, checking for fire under the eaves, whispering the names of neighbors who would come to help. At one point, a figure tried the cellar door and found it braced by the Duncan's arm. The attacker cursed and thumbed a match, but no lantern came. The house could not be toppled in mere minutes. It had withstood the wind. It had been built with steady hands. The men pressed, then faltered. They made a shallow retreat into the darker brush and fought with the night, not with conviction. It was Morrison who made the decisive move. He had slipped a small party around the far side of the house, quiet as a fox. They had found the attackers' horses tethered by a ridge and taken them. A rider floundering by the fence found himself surprised by neighbors' hands, and soon was on his knees, bleeding from a grazed scalp and the revelation of capture. Garrett Kincaid was taken, not shot, but brought in with ropes on his wrists, arguing and hissing from the humiliation. Dawson, seeing his son captured, and the night coat of failure beginning to settle over his plans, fled like a man who understands that his ledger can be undone by law as easily as by force. He rode hard into the dark. He would not be seen for another day. People later would say that he had gone to his sisters in town, or that he simply wanted space to think. He did not return to the homestead that night. When the sun rose, the evidence was plain. Hoof marks, a dented fence, a lantern smothered in the fallen ditch, a mild trail of blood where a man's scalp had been grazed by a brute's carelessness. Garrett sat under a cottonwood with his hands bound and a deputy at his elbow. He glared like a man who had been robbed of an advantage and resented the world for maintaining a principle that surprised him. Marshal Briggs had arrived before daylight, as he had vowed.
He had a writ, a presence, and the muscle of law behind him. He listened to testimony with a patient face. He took Clara's written statement and asked terse questions that were meant to be used later in court. He documented the injuries, the damage, the names of the men who had stood watch. He read the ridge like a ledger that needed balancing. "You did right to keep to the law," he told Clara quietly when the testimony ended. "We'll get this to a court. We'll take it down as it happened." Clara answered in a tone that was both weary and decisive. "I will tell the truth," she said. "What happened at the arroyo, what Mr. Hale did, what I saw when they came at night." It was one of the times in a life when the small things become large. Her handwriting on a page, the way her words might bend a scale. She did not say it felt triumphant, she only did it because she had promised herself she would be active and not bartered as a symbol. The trial, when it finally convened in the territorial town a week later, was the slow thing that makes justice credible and infuriating at once. Miles of travel made witnesses late. A telegraph line meant speed but not immediacy. The court convened in an adobe building with a wooden dais and a judge whose face had been carved by years of stoicism. The prosecution was careful, the defense was practiced. Kincaid hired a man with a liking for the written word and the talent of minimizing violence as misunderstandings. He pleaded for mitigating circumstances, for a gentleman's argument, for the complexity of land titles and the difficulties of ownership. But the territory's jury did not like intimidation dressed as civility. The evidence was handled with the slow, fogged care of law. Clara testified in front of a room that smelled of pipe smoke and nerves. She told of the arroyo, of Tom Breslin's fall, of Rowan Hale's dive into the river and the transfer of June into his arms. She told of men arriving at night, of the pounding on the Duncan door, of how she had hidden in the root cellar and listened to the night. Her words were not theatrical, they were precise, the register of someone who had seen the world narrow to a few terrible facts, and who had done the thing that adults must, arrange them into sentences. Rowan sat in the back, silent and steady. He had been subpoenaed not merely as a witness, but as the man whose risk had become the hinge of the entire case. Santos sat beside him like a small, calm fortress. Neighbors swelled the gallery. Cooper, Morrison, Bill Weatherby, Chen, each called to speak to the character of the Duncans and Hale and to the nature of the valley. They spoke of the Kincaid men as they would of wolves, steady in number, hungry for convenience.
Garrett pleaded as the young do, angry, wounded, caught by his own arrogance. He did not deny being at the scene. He tried to claim he had been asking questions. The jury could weigh the difference between asking and threatening. Dawson, who had remained a shadow on a ridge, never took the stand. He had by then been taken ill. People said it was just nerves. Other people had other measures. The truth was that a few days after Garrett's arrest, while a messenger rode between the town and a place where Dawson had gone to consider his options, the man's heart gave out. He was found slumped in his chair in a rented room, the color of a man who had suddenly had all his numbers fail him. A doctor pronounced it a heart attack, and the man was buried with a small private funeral that did not bring him neighbors, only a list of creditors. The trial moved forward. Garrett was found guilty of attempted intimidation and of deliberately equipping men to make an unlawful assault. The judge, who understood that law in the territory could not appear weak lest it invite more blood, sentenced him to a term that would put him behind bars away from the valley. He would be shipped to the penitentiary under escort. Later, while in custody, Garrett grew sick. Pride is often a poor companion inside a dark cell. And the journal of his sentence noted that he had died within a year of incarceration, a footnote of consequence that the valley carried like a wound and a lesson. There was an awful human satisfaction in the verdict that did not undo the arroyo or bring Tom back. It did, however, make clear one thing. Law could work if people kept their nerve and testified. It made clear that a man with a name could not buy the ease of others without consequence. The Duncans could keep their spring for now. The valley breathed as best the valley could.
The days that followed the trial passed in patterns that felt at once mundane and miraculous. The Hale Ranch and the Duncan homestead shared resources. Supplies came from Silver Ridge and from wagons that took the long route around washed gullies. Men mended fences. Women took in eggs and milk. The world repaired itself with hands and with talk, with small acts that accumulate into a life. For Clara, the days slid into a new texture. She had been given a choice the morning after the trial, to leave for Maggie's or to stay put until the road dried. The choice was no longer purely practical. It had been altered by the man who had taken her child from the creek and held her safe. She had the right to move, to find the room and bread Maggie promised. But Hale's Bend had become, in a few intense days, a place of friends and a home that offered a different kind of steadiness. She also felt a private curiosity at the way Rowan looked at June, the way he kept his hand near a small, soft bundle as if afraid it might vanish.
The thought that a man who had closed his house might keep it open for her made her both frightened and oddly hopeful. Rowan, for his part, found himself offering help in ways that had nothing to do with heroics. He showed Clara the small, practical things of ranch work, how to throw hay so it would not weather on the ground, how to skin a rabbit and make the meat sweat away from the hide, how to tend a spring so that the water would not pool and bring contamination. His teaching was patient. A slow unfastening of the hard places grief had closed around him. He taught by doing rather than by speech, by showing how to mend rather than by explaining why. He told her small stories about Christopher once, nothing like a sermon, only the way a man might mention a portrait hanging quietly in a hall. Clara listened and added pieces of her life. They began to fit, awkwardly at first, into a map that was not yet a home but might become one. Santos took to the role of a quiet godfather to June. He hummed old songs he said his mother had taught him, names that meant light and bread. He started a small patch of squash near the house fence, and in the evenings he would sit with Clara on the stoop and tell of Sonora and of a time his hands had held a bigger, warmer family. He was not a man who swore much, but when he did, it was usually a prayer under his breath. He had the dignity of someone who'd seen vindication taste like ash and still chose to keep cooking. The valley's gossip was at first tempered by respect. People like to talk. They also like to know who will stand with whom in storms. Clara's presence at the ranch shifted things that long habits had trained. Men who might otherwise have made a joke looked at her with the gravity of those who understood the costs of losing a family to a storm. The months moved like this, small stitches of days. Spring turned into summer and turned into a season where calves were born and wheat was cut. Rowan and Clara's closeness was not a single dramatic arc, but a series of patient, unshouted acts. A mended shirt left on a peg, a loaf of bread appearing on the table, a hand offered at the edge of a fence to steady a stranger, becoming a touch that meant trust. They did not announce love with fireworks. It came instead like a steady conflagration that brightened corners over time. There were moments that acted like punctuation marks in their slow courtship. One afternoon, after a storm had washed a low crossing and Rowan had been out repairing a ford, he found Clara bent by a fence, coaxing a recalcitrant calf. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair pinned back with a practical pin. He stood and watched for a breath. The sight of her ordinary and small and enormous at once. She looked up and smiled, not startling, but pleased with the sight of him. "You missed your calling," she said. "You should have been an instructor." He laughed, a small sound. "I'm no instructor. I'm a stubborn man who mends fences."
But I'll teach a willing pupil. Another evening he read a letter from Maggie aloud, the kind of short epistolary things that told their private mischiefs and the ingredients of a family that must be coaxed together at times. Clara relished the idea of marriage as something that could be slowly stitched together with a hand and a pledge, and not as one sudden, reckless leap. She wanted to love and to be practical. She wanted to be warm in a house and to watch children learn the names of birds. The particular desire for a steadiness that came from such life was not a dramatic thing. It was domestic and therefore important. One night, with a moon hung like a coin over the stables, Rowan spoke first, as if he had been rehearsing for years. The subject was serious but not ornate. "I didn't know I could do something like that again," he said, meaning he did not know he could risk for someone else and then allow himself to feel attached. The water took what it took. It made me keep one hand open for a while. After the flood, I didn't want to close my hands again. Clara listened. She had learned to listen not for speeches, but for the small confessions that mean more than vows. She placed June in Rowan's arms briefly. She let him share the child as if handing off a small piece of trust. June reached for him and giggled at the touch of a man she already recognized as belonging to her household. "Then don't," she said simply. "Keep your hand open." They were married in the late summer, a modest ceremony by the edge of the hale spring. There was no grand church to tie the knot. There was instead a traveling minister, an itinerant with a voice like a bell who had officiated at more weddings and funerals than most men had counted, and a small circle of neighbors. Maggie and Thomas traveled up from Silver Ridge with a basket of fresh pies. Santos braided June's hair with a tiny ribbon and declared solemnly that he would be godfather. Morrison provided a slab of beef. Marshal Briggs stood to the side and doffed his hat. The vows were not ornate but direct. They promised not riches but companionship, not miracles but mutual care. They sealed their pledges with a kiss and a small cheer from the neighbors who came to see what families are made of. Marriage did not end the law's business. The valley still had to manage its claims, and the slow, honest work of life went on. But it altered the frame of the small household, making two people into a single center of gravity for a child and for neighbors in need of help. Not long after their marriage, thin as those early months with careful economy, Clara bore a son. They named him Daniel Christopher, a small, belated compromise that honored the memory Rowan carried and the promise of something fresh. The name Christopher held a quiet gratitude, a life given in memory and reclaimed in joy. When the child was small, Clara would hold him and glance at Rowan and Santos and the house and think of Tom Breslin's hat folded neatly in a chest. Grief had not vanished, but it had been joined with gratitude in a way that felt balanced, like a scale that had been given a counterweight. Santos kept his promise as godfather. He taught the boy his first words in Sonoran Spanish, then laughed and corrected himself in the language of the valley. He took on the household's cooking with a particular devotion to tamales and a stew that came from his mother's recipe. When the winter winds came, Santos would wrap the boy's small head and tell him about the desert's way of keeping secrets and the way it keeps a man honest. The valley's recovery made room for other threads. Neighbors who had not spoken much now came together for harvest, for the building of a new fence where the flood had taken the old. They built irrigation channels with hands and with talk, and with a law that was a ledger of small concessions. The trial's verdict remained a promise, that intimidation would be answered in a court, that men could not simply claim another spring without proof. It did not make the Consincade name vanish from gossip, but it tempered its edge. Rowan kept telling the tale of the arroyo in small ways, never as performance, but as a matter-of-fact story told at a supper table, as something a child should know about the way the world had been cruel and also kind. June would ask for the story when she felt stormy. Daniel Christopher would grow up with two stories in his head, that his father had once lost a son and found himself less afraid to save another, and that a flood had been stopped by a man who had no more reason to fight than the river had to spare mercy. There were losses that hung like shadows still. Tom Breslin's name came up in quiet talk at the ranch. A small grave by the country road got a marker, simple, nailed by hand. Clara visited sometimes with domestic offerings, bread, fresh eggs. She planted a flower near his grave and would whisper a small thanks for what had been done at the arroyo. Grief and gratitude can cohabit. Sometimes they sit at the same table in a house like Hale's Bend.
One autumn evening, when the light had thinned to a molten gold and the river ran placid under a sky free of immediate threat, Rowan and Clara walked to the very spot where the flood had first reared like a physical thing to swallow the wagon. They walked with two children's hands in their own, June's, now older, and the small premature fingers of Daniel Christopher. The memory of that day had been transformed by living, into a story with a moral and a family at its center. Rowan stood on the bank and felt the water as he always did now, not as a thing that might kill, but as an agent that must be respected.
He looked at Clara. She looked back at him with something like relief and something like a steady, soft joy that only people who have been through storms can carry. "You ever regret the water?" she asked, the question both literal and rhetorical. He considered it and thought of the long months when he had closed his house and cut himself from the world. He thought of Maria and Christopher and the hollow he had carried. He thought of the way his life had been given a hinge and swung differently. "Regret?" he said slowly. "No, I don't. Not now. Not when I look at them." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. The children splashed their toes, and June laughed at a small splash that sent droplets like tiny meteors. The creek had become a different thing, a place of recreation, of washing, of careful attention. The same breath of water that had been a force had become a daily giver in other ways. The line between destroyer and giver is thin. The valley had learned that lesson by price and by choice. A year after the flood, they gathered at the creek again. Neighbors, friends, and a small assembly of people who had been part of the valley's repair. Marshal Briggs came with a hat in hand. Morrison brought a pie and a bright-eyed son. Santos arrived with a small bundle of gifts from Sonora he said were only trinkets but had the weight of kin. They sat on the bank and let the children dip their feet. The sun sat low and forgiving. Rowan told the story for the 100th time, not as a boast, but as a remembrance. He told how the water had taken a wagon, how a man named Tom had been lost, and how a stranger, who came to be a man in Rowan's life, had risked the swift river. He spoke of Clara's courage in giving June into his arms, and of how others had stood for the law when intimidation came. Each telling was slightly different in the way memory shifts with sympathy and time. Clara listened with the kind of silence that is a conversation. She thought about the day she handed June to Rowan's arms, and how in that motion she had given the world a vote, that she would not be bartered for water, that she would be a voice in a community that would not be cowed. Looking at the children, she felt the old fear loosen at the seams, not vanished, but made manageable. When the sun dipped and the shadows longed to pool, Rowan took Clara's hand and, the way a man does when he has learned the art of small devotion, kissed it. They had both been altered by grief and by the river, each bearing evidence, each bearing the proof that rescue sometimes remakes people into one another. Their life went on. There were births and funerals, harvests and tricks of drought. There were letters from Sonora about Santos's family, and smiles from Maggie and Thomas sent with pies for weddings and christenings. Garrett Kinsinkite's name became a story told to warn the young, that might without law is hollow, and that law, when used, can protect the small and the plain. Dawson Kinsinkate's absence became another weathered fact in the ledger of the valley. Rowan kept the hat he had fished from the river, Tom Breslin's hat, in a place that was not ceremonial but practical. It lived on a peg by the stove, and sometimes Clara would set a fresh ribbon at its seam. They tended the spring together, because nothing in that country was safe solely by luck. They fenced their land in good faith and repaired the low crossing where the flood had scoured the bank. They learned new patterns of vigilance that were not fear, but care. People would someday tell versions of the story that smoothed its edges and turned Rowan into a mythic figure, the kind of cowboy who leaps and saves without consequence or gravity. The truth in the valley refused such simple retellings.
Rowan had waded into the flood and saved a child. He had scars and a tremor in his forearm from where the current had cut him. He had nights where grief returned like a cold. He also had mornings where he would rise and make coffee for Clara and an armful of children. He had days when the law's slow work made him impatient, and days when he felt thankful the jury had spoken. He had love, which was perhaps the more dangerous and more beautiful thing of all. Clara, once a widow carrying a bundle and a letter, had become a woman who could stand before a court and speak plain truths. A woman who could mend and drive and manage a household. A woman who could rear children and hold grief and joy in the same two hands. She had been active at every turn. She had refused to be bartered by a landowner. She had written her testimony with a careful hand, and she had sheltered herself and her child during the siege in the cellar. She had chosen to stay and helped build a life that made the valley better for others. Years later, their children would run along the same banks where the flood had made them fearful, building dams with childish hands and laughing when the water escaped. Rowan would crouch and fix a twig with the neatness of a man who had learned that small things matter. Clara would sit with a basket, not the traveling woman she had once been, but a settled person who had learned that one could be both tender and resolute. The valley, too, was different. It had scars and repairs and a new patience for the law and for communal courage. The flood that had dashed a wagon and taken a life had also exposed the hunger of greedy men. The community's response, lawful, organized, and courageous, had saved them from a second loss. That double rescue, the physical rescue at the arroyo and the civic rescue of neighbors banding to keep water and land from being used as a weapon, became the valley's story. It taught them that survival was a mixture of quick action and slow justice. At the creek one evening, the children made a small pile of stones and asked Rowan to tell again how he had dived into the water. If this story moved something inside you, please share where you're watching from in the comments and what part of the rescue or the aftermath stayed with you most. If you like these long-form frontier stories, consider subscribing to hear more tales where ordinary people do the hard, brave thing. They walked back along the path, carrying a small piece. The flood that had threatened to undo them had, in the end, been the hinge on which several lives turned. A man who risked everything to save a child, a widow who refused to be bartered, a community that put law before the lash of private force. It was not a tidy moral. No tempest leaves such gifts without cost. But it was the truth they lived in the guts of their days. And so the creek went on, patient and indifferent, and now shared. The valley watched it, and it watched them return to the ordinary business of living well, cooking, watching small ones sleep, mending, laughing, planting, testifying once more that courage and law and quiet kindness might, together, keep a place from being eaten by men or by storm. The hat on the peg rested under the eaves, the name of Tom Breslin remembered with a small, steady sorrow. Rowan bent sometimes and ran his thumb along its brim, as if in thanks to the day that had asked him to risk everything and to the life that had come out of that asking. The last light slipped into the arroyo and the valley, and with one quick look across the creek, as if to touch the memory and not let it rain, Rowan and Clara walked home into the room that 3 lives would share. Hands warm, children breathing softly, the river's distant voice like an old warning and an older promise. The day the flood almost took them had, in time, shown them what could be saved: a child's life, a sister's home, a community's law, and a family made by deliberate, slow, good acts. If you were moved by this story, please consider subscribing for more long-form tales from the frontier, and share this with someone who loves stories of courage and community.